Working Group Charlie is called Vegetation Fire Crisis Mitigation. We are increasingly using the term landscape fire instead. The workshop, which was organized in Berlin, back-to-back with the Delta Group, convened experts from throughout Europe and associated countries to the Horizon 2020 agenda. We followed the standard rules of convening and organizing the workshop. What was different to other workshops was that we distributed a questionnaire to the invited experts, including those who finally, due to some technical reasons, could not attend. And we then later evaluated these questionnaires, which had been developed independently without the group discussion, and compared it with the results of the discussions at the workshop. So I'm not going to read everything which you find on the slides, and you will get that presentation anyway. The two scenarios that we addressed during the workshop were quite different. The first one was to deal with a large, complex and aggressive wildfire. And basically this scenario was determined by the impressions of the 2017 fires that burned in Portugal, which were kind of symbolic for the increasing problems that we are facing here in Europe with regards to extreme fires, extreme fire behavior, and also involving a lot of casualties. In the second scenario, we were looking on the underlying causes of this development. Of course, we all know that climate change is playing a role, but most importantly is that in Europe, our change of landscape patterns are related to land use change, notably caused by land abandonment, the rural exodus, the urbanization, and consequently the old cultural landscapes. Let us always remember that in Europe we do have indeed natural landscapes, but the cultural landscapes are pretty much dominant. And so changes in the land cultivation means indeed that there are changes also in the flammability and the wildfire hazard and so on. So taking this into consideration and the fact that many countries are not yet well prepared because there is no appropriate planning, there are no, let me say, publicly supported measures to react and to respond to this development of this increasing wildfire hazard. There is indeed a lack of proactive, mostly preventive action, the lack of policies, the lack of application of principles of integrated fire management. The 16 experts representing 12 countries, which were contacted by the pre-workshop survey, delivered their expert opinion in a number of themes. They mostly agreed that the natural landscapes, that these are insufficiently treated with regards to fire hazard and fire management. The same is referring to the cultural landscapes, where the communities and the public are not really aware of the increasing threats and the increasing dangers in these changing landscapes. That there is a need for improvement, and we are using or applying the terminology of a green economy, an economy that takes into consideration the, on the one side, the productivity of our landscapes, on the other side, the right utilization of this productivity in terms of utilization of the biomass, the phytomass, the plant biomass, instead of leaving it in the landscape and being exposed to the fire, to become utilized for food, energy, and so on. The interface between urban and the open landscapes, sometimes referred to as the wildland-urban interface. Often it's not really urban, it's residential, it's villages, farmstead, isolated farms and homes that are threatened by the fires. The causes of fire in many parts of Europe, escaped agricultural burnings and carelessness are the main causes of these fires. Of course, we do have natural fires like lightning, but as we know from the statistics in Europe, they are marginal. Only 1 to 2% of the ignitions are caused by lightning. And we do have observations, and especially our representative from the United Kingdom talked about a massive amount of arson fires, and indeed we have the same, for instance, in Germany. The lack of interagency cooperation and coordination and the interoperability between agencies inside the countries as well as among or between the countries has been addressed by the survey. And what is also important is that the so-called science policy interface, and we expanded this term, the interface between scientists, policymakers, and practitioners is not well developed. So we see on the one side that the research, the existing knowledge, the scientific knowledge is there. It is often not used in the extent it should be used and stays very often in the shelves. And our decision makers are not really provided with those tools that would serve to apply this scientific knowledge. The question of fire prevention, the fire hazard or the fuel reduction, the risk reduction has been identified as a gap. Also in this survey, the experts expressed their opinion on the barriers that determine the effectiveness of interagency coordination. So I'm not reading all this, you can see this on the screen. With regards to technologies, there's basically no shortage of technologies. This was a kind of common response of the experts. So there is not really an outspoken need for more technology per se. It's a question of application. It's a question of application of the right technology in fire management in general. So in summary, and the main conclusions is that this problem of the rural exodus is the highest priority challenge for determining the threats of wildfires in our cultural and natural landscapes. The other prevailing opinion was that aerial firefighting, which has become very popular in some countries, also at the political level, has not been considered as critical or important. The experts agreed that very often the focus on aerial firefighting, including exchange between countries, is too costly and very often less effective as desired. And this indeed has to do with the still not sufficient air-to-air and, most importantly, air-to-ground or ground-to-air coordination. Always let us remember that an aerial delivery of suppressant of water is an auxiliary tool for the ground forces that allows them for a very short time frame of some minutes, I would say, to take advantage of the cooling or distinguishing effects. So if an aerial drop is not coordinated very precise, it may become absolutely useless and costly, and this money could be invested somewhere else. Some special challenges are related to some of the heritage of industrial activities, conflicts and accidents in our landscapes in Europe. We will come back later to this question of fire management on contaminated terrain, which would include fires burning from vegetation into waste deposits and so on, which is a big problem with regards to contaminants, pollution, emissions of dangerous substances. Cross-border cooperation and coordination is underway, but there are still challenges with regards to interoperability, standardization, and so on. Training has been considered as a key factor for the success of building fire management capacities in the countries. In many countries, we are lacking dedicated training programs. This is, of course, there's a difference between the countries south of the Alps, the Euro-Mediterranean countries, which are very experienced, but the countries north of the Alps, in the more temperate Atlantic climate, our fire services in general are not as well prepared and trained in landscape fire management. The role of volunteer fire services is important, and indeed there are some countries, including, for instance, Germany, where I'm coming from, where all firefighting in the rural areas to 100% depends on volunteer fire departments. We have professional firefighters only in the largest cities. So vegetation fire management is by volunteers. So this is an important target group which we need to consider. The role of NGOs, clearly it's an untapped resource. We can see in some countries, especially in the Eastern Europe, that non-government organizations are taking initiatives where the state does not seem to function. So this is what we need to keep in mind. Also the experience of countries in the developing world where the governmental authorities are quite weak, and indeed fire prevention, self-defense of villages and rural communities very much depends on civil society and their own action, and that is in line with the recommendations of the first group that presented today. The use of fire as a proactive measure in reducing wildfire hazard and fighting fire with fire, the so-called suppression firing, is not very common. It's actually hardly used in Europe, only in a few countries. Sometimes our experts say it's illegal, which indeed may be the case or is the case in many countries, but we have to move away from this and train our firefighters to indeed take advantage of a fire as a tool in the prevention, but also in the suppression of wildfires. The workshop results, the identified challenges included stating that there is a lack of synergy and communication between coordinating bodies in the European Union and the Commission with regards to tackling the underlying causes and the management of large fires, of extreme fires. We also heard this morning that large fire incidents, always considering that a small regular fire can be handled by the authorities, but a large extreme fire occurs seldom, and that our firefighters, the incident commanders, usually do not have an experience to deal with a very large extreme fire. Again, just an example from our home country, the last largest fires in Germany are more than 40 years ago. Since then we have 2 generations of people who have never experienced such a fire. There is a lack of tools, supporting tools, ranging from early warning to SOPs. The question of agency fragmentation is particularly true in countries that have a federal structure where there is firefighting responsibility, very often own rules, own training within the department, states or Länder of the countries. So there's also a problem of agencies that may not wish to cooperate. It's a question of pride, complacency, and so on. I think, you know, all these aspects that were identified by the workshop, they are very comprehensive. You may all read this in the summarized results of the workshop outcomes, so that we may not spend too much time on this because it's also kind of repetitive to what I said earlier. The identified best practices include a catalog of recommendations that are derived from looking to other parts of the world, like to North America, to other continents. There is a challenge and an opportunity that we are exchanging between the countries that have developed different expertise, special expertise, especially in those countries where large fires are more frequent and common. Again, emphasis was put on the question of subsidizing activities that benefit fire prevention, communication strategies, and also the question of fire use. The situation assessment of ongoing fires is a very important. In many countries, we are lacking the expertise and the professional expertise of personnel to do the proper assessment of an ongoing fire in order to determine, for instance, the type of response, the amount of personnel needed, So there is a high need for developing better preparedness planning, scenario planning, and finally, again, looking at the underlying fire hazard, that is the fuels and the characteristics of the landscapes. Volunteer involvement has been repeatedly identified as an important goal. The evaluations of lessons identified and lessons learned is what is very often lacking. Finally, the Fire In project is a 5-year activity. It offers an opportunity to practice, to exercise exchange within the community of practitioners here in Europe. And within the 5 years, we hope that the exchange between those who are working isolated and who are not connected, or the exchange between various networks that we have in Europe, also those operating globally, that they are becoming more familiar and interactive. And within the Fire In project itself, we should continue exercising the cross-cutting issues, and this is why, for instance, we organized our workshop together with the Delta group, with the Natural Hazards group, because the Natural Hazards group will be the next presentation after the coffee break, addressed the scenario of floods. And very often floods and fire effects are closely connected. Let us just think about this very large fire, very intense fire that occurred a couple of months ago in California, which caused a high amount of damages. But after the fire, the torrential rains that started in California indeed caused the secondary damages, which in the end were much higher than the damages by the fire itself. So the interconnectedness of extreme events like extreme fires and extreme precipitation leads us for a need to coordinate the proactive and the response measures at landscape level between the various players and the various responders. And there's also another example which we exercised, and that is fire management on contaminated terrain, which is a cross-cutting issue between the Charlie and the Echo group with the CBRNE group. Because very often the specialists on fire management and those who are dealing with radioactivity, nuclear and explosive issues are not really familiar with each other and the themes, and this is why we invited also the representative from Ukraine who is with us today, Dr. Sergei Ziptsev from the Regional Fire Management Resource Center in Eastern Europe and Ukraine. And 1 month ago we had an exercise between these two types of expert groups, in this case between Belarus and Ukraine, addressing a fire, a simulated fire that was burning on contaminated terrain close to the borders. So the idea was to exercise both the border crossing dimension of cooperation and fire, as well as the threats of radioactivity released by the fire, because it burns on radioactively contaminated terrain, releasing plutonium, cesium, strontium, and posing a risk to the local population and to the firefighters. And the other exercise is actually only 4 days ago, looking at the question of unexploded ordnance and wildfires. Here, Germany is an example. 2% of our national territory is contaminated by unexploded ordnance, and other countries like on the Western Balkans, where we have large areas contaminated by landmines, This was part of a scenario that was actually preceded by a small wildfire caused by lightning 3 weeks ago in Germany, where new technologies were used for the first time. It was quite innovative for the case of Germany. It is a small area, very interesting, a small opening in a forest with a regenerated forest which was struck by lightning. And from the aerial observation, it looked like that the fire was not significant, but the use of the FLIR, of the forward-looking infrared camera mounted on a drone, showed the hotspots and the fires burning in the raw humus and in the organic terrain. And the development of explosive-safe firefighting units like these tanks was demonstrated last Saturday. In the end of my presentation, I would like to show the fire triangle to you. Of course, the inner one you are very familiar with. But the new fire triangle that we are facing now, that is not only oxygen and air, it is climate and climate change. And the fuel is actually the changing land use, the changing flammability of our landscape. And we also have to look from a multidisciplinary point of view to what is coming out of these fires. And this is a kind of political heat. And this is where we have to look at in the future, in the coming years of the Fire-In project, and look if we can embed all the recommendations that we are generating from the experts in this project into something that in the end could become a policy here in Europe that would take into consideration the very complex issues related to fire. Thank you.